Arthur Kaluma has picked his landing spot for his last year of college basketball. Is he the final piece of the puzzle that will put Texas in the SEC's upper echelon in their first year in the conference?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Monday, happy July, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade. You are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. Like here, it's July. It is the middle of the offseason. It is the start of new conference realignment in college athletics, and we're still here with you 5 days per week. Want to shout out all the everyday listeners, those of you who join us every single day on the show on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Also want to shout out those of you who are hanging out with us in our Discord channel. If you have not done so yet, there is a link in the show notes. It is free to join. We're hanging out talking college hoops all the time. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. As the playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. There's something for everybody every day, so visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, we didn't get to some of the newsy stuff that happened at the end of last week because we were focused on talking about the NBA draft. So we're going to hit some of that stuff today. Arthur Kaluma, one of the last big names in the transfer portal, has committed to Texas. We'll talk about that, what it means for him, what it means for the Longhorns as they move into the SEC. We're also going to talk about Texas's former conference, the Big 12. They have announced their conference opponents. We're going to talk about what those matchups look like, who's going where, what it means for the new four corner schools coming into the Big 12. And then we're going to close out the show talking about the Big East. They have a new media rights deal sticking with Fox, but they're adding some other partners. It's a really good long-term, potentially sustainable option for the Big East. And we're going to talk about what that means for college basketball. Isaac, before we get into all that, quickly, thoughts are with Dick Vitale, legendary college basketball broadcaster. He has surgery coming up. He's got another bout of cancer. He's been battling cancer off and on for the last couple of years. A true warrior, a trooper. I'm really hoping that he can pull through. And if the best case scenario, get back to calling some games, but if not, hopefully just continue to have a successful surgery and keep on going, because he's been a titan in college basketball. And I'm hoping that this all goes well for him.
Well said, Andy.
Let's talk Arthur Kaluma, Isaac. We got a guy who's sort of staying in the Big 12. Like it feels like he's staying in the Big 12, coming back to Texas after being at Kansas State. But of course, Texas will not be in the Big 12 next year as they make that transition to the SEC. Kaluma, a guy who was 2 years at Creighton, declared for the NBA draft, went through the process, decided to remove himself from the NBA draft, transferred to Kansas State, played for Jerome Tang last year, had a fantastic season for Tang and the Wildcats, about 14.5 points, 7 boards, 2 assists per game, career high 34.5% from three, a lot more attempts than typical. We really saw him kind of blossom into more of a focal point offensively for that Kansas State team. And he did kind of the same thing this year, hit the transfer portal, went through the draft process, pulled his name out of the draft process. We were kind of unsure where he was going to end up. And now we know he's joining Rodney Terry's team. He's joining the Longhorns, the last piece, 13th scholarship player for Rodney Terry's team. Isaac, what are your thoughts on Kaluma's fit here for this Texas team as they move into the SEC?
You know, Andy, it's funny because even though he had literally every statistical category you just mentioned was a career high for Kaluma and really impressive. But what we didn't say about that Kansas State team is they didn't make the NCAA tournament. So I think it's good that now he can go back. Kind of, I really liked more where he was at Creighton, where he didn't have to be the offensive focus. And I think that will once again be the case at Texas, where you've got guys coming in like Tremont Mark, like Jordan Pope, who I think can take some of that offensive weight off of Kaluma's shoulders, which similar to how we talked about Harrison Ingram last year, going from Stanford to North Carolina. He was able to be the guy when he didn't have to be the guy. And I think that's kind of a similar scenario for Arthur Kaluma here, is that it allows him to flourish a little more. And so we might see some dips back down in some of those statistics you just mentioned. But Andy, ultimately, I think he will be more efficient. And ultimately, I think he will be able to be a better contributor to a team where he's not number one on the scouting report for the opposition, allowing him to just come in. Now, I do think, and we'll get to this, I do think he will start for this Longhorns team, giving anything unforeseen. But I think that he's now probably third, maybe fourth, depending on how good Trey Johnson is as a freshman on that scouting report.
Yeah, and I think like it's interesting because you kind of, it's fun to try to read between the lines and look at which players maybe how they interpreted the feedback that they got through the draft process. And obviously we don't know unless Kaluma very specifically talks about it, which he's unlikely to do. But there are a handful of players who I think make a decision to transfer somewhere where they can have a role that's more similar to the role that they would play in the NBA. And a lot of times that requires you to transfer somewhere where you're probably going to get less touches and you're not going to, you're going to be in a different role where you're not as ball dominant. And obviously, every year we see players transfer from mid majors to high majors and take on different roles. And you mentioned Harrison Ingram. Obviously Stanford's not a mid major, but it was the kind of move where he goes from being a more ball dominant player, which is not the role that any NBA scout, they weren't looking at Harrison Ingram and thinking that's what he's going to do at the next level. But what he did at Carolina, that's more similar. And then, he goes and gets drafted because of that. I'll use an example this year, similar to Kaluma, Michael Ajayi, at Pepperdine, he was the man. He's 17 points a game, 10 rebounds. He's not going to be that at Gonzaga, but if he plays a role in that starting lineup as their second, third, maybe even fourth leading scorer, but just fulfills that role, that's what he's going to look like in the NBA. And I think Kaluma has made a similar decision of going to a Texas school where, Jordan Pope's going to be a guy with the ball in his hands a lot. Tremont Mark's going to have the ball in his hands a lot. And Kaluma's going to fill more of a complementary type role. And I think that if he thrives in that role, which he did at Creighton, so it's not hard to project him being able to do that. We've seen it. Yeah, it seems very likely he will be able to succeed, and Texas does well. Like I want to talk about the Texas side of this move, but from a Kaluma perspective, the numbers are probably going to dip a little bit, but if he's similarly efficient or more efficient, and just from an eye test perspective, looks fluid in that role, looks successful without the ball, like he moves well without the ball, makes good cuts, etc. That I think helps his draft stock. So it's always risky to come back to school when you're an older prospect, but for Kaluma, I think that there are reasons to believe that this move can help him in his quest to be an NBA player at the next level.
Yeah. And as we had previously talked about with the Dillons out the door, Dessou and Mitchell, there's a lot of opportunities at the wing and the power forward. And I think Kaluma, depending, as we often say, in this positionless era of basketball, depending on personnel and opponent, he can slot in as a 4 or a 3. And sometimes it probably doesn't even matter which one you put on the box score. He's just going to go out and play. And you said you want to talk about the Texas side of this. Let's go to that starting lineup first. We've already mentioned Jordan Pope, Tremont Mark, and Arthur Kaluma. Do you see those two guys as kind of the starting backcourt, Kaluma coming in as the 4? And if the answers to those are yes, who would you slot in alongside them as the 3 and the 5?
Yeah, I think Shedrick's pretty obvious at the 5, assuming health and everything for him. He's going to be your starting center. I think Kaluma's going to start at the 4. And like you said, I think that Mark and Pope are going to be your 2 starting backcourt options. That last spot, I think it's probably being kind of saved right now for Trey Johnson, obviously a highly regarded incoming freshman. He's 6'6". I think he's kind of a 2-3 hybrid. Different recruiting services list him as a shooting guard or a small forward. He seems to play up for his size a little bit. Certainly Kaluma is the bigger and stronger player and would be the 4 in that starting lineup. But I could see Trey Johnson starting at the 3, sort of starting at the 2. Him and Mark, it's kind of interchangeable again. Basketball is borderline positionless these days anyway. If Trey Johnson's not ready for whatever reason, I could see Kendall Weaver stepping into the starting lineup. He's been with that team for a while, a really kind of versatile backup guard. He's smaller, so if he were to step into the lineup, Mark would kind of slide up to the 3. But I think it would still work. I think that team would still be big enough and versatile enough to compete in the SEC. You got the other transfers coming in from Indiana State, Julian Larry and Jason Kent, two guys who played well in Josh Schertz's system last year. You got Malik Presley. He's kind of another 3-4 hybrid from Vanderbilt. I don't see him being an immediate contributor necessarily, but you got a couple other freshmen coming in as well. Like, this is a team that's got a lot of depth, a lot of talent on the roster. I would be stunned if Kaluma doesn't start, but I could see him being kind of tossed into multiple different roles, depending. A lot of it, I think, hinges on how ready Trey Johnson is. If he's ready to roll, I think you have yourself a really quality starting five. And you do have two guys, Pope and Mark, who are used to being kind of ball dominant guys. So I'm curious how that will play out. But obviously, Rodney Terry had a lot of success bringing in a guy in Max Asmus, who was one of the most ball dominant players that we've ever seen in college basketball, and they were able to work with that, and Tyrese Hunter and other pieces on that roster. So I think that they're going to be well equipped to handle that. But yeah, Kaluma is not going to be putting up 15 and 7, most likely with the talent around him.
But boy, if he did, along with that, that'd be crazy. And,
Yeah.
and like, I'm also curious. You said, how will those two ball dominant guys go?
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious to see how Rodney Terry manages using all 13 scholarships, which we don't typically see. Very quickly, Andy, because I know we need to keep moving, but because of the transfer portal and things we've seen, what I thought was going to be an SEC that wasn't quite as top heavy as last year. Boy, that opinion for me has changed now with what Alabama is looking like, what Auburn's looking like, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas A&M even. That to me kind of is the top 5 before this happened. And I'm wondering, with the addition of Kaluma, do we think there's enough depth, talent, capability, team chemistry, whatever you want to say there, to get Texas into that top 5? Or are they kind of what we were saying about Kansas State a week or two ago after the Coleman Hawkins commit, that it's like, man, they're knocking on that door, but maybe in that second tier right now?
I think they're in that second tier. I think Bama and Tennessee and Arkansas and Auburn kind of feel like, and you could order it a handful of different ways, but that feels like a really strong 4 right there. A&M's on here. I think they're in that conversation as well. I think Florida is in that conversation as well.
Big Blue Nation's going to be mad we haven't mentioned them.
Yeah, exactly. Handlockton being hurt is an issue for them, but I like the guard room a lot for Todd Golden's team. So I think they're kind of in that mix, and I think Texas is right in there, like 6-7 range, somewhere in there. I wouldn't be like, if you told me right now Texas is going to finish top 5 in the SEC, that wouldn't shock me. If you told me they're going to finish outside the top 8, that wouldn't stun me, but I would be a little surprised. But I see them in that like 5 to 8 range in the SEC. But again, they're also going to be going to new arenas and playing new teams and adjusting to new personnel. Like, it's a lot that is changing for Texas. And I do think that some of those just the changes of travel and going to new arenas and everything can kind of trip up teams in a new conference. So I'm cautiously optimistic about the Longhorns. I think this is a good team, but it's a darn good SEC as well.
It is a darn good SEC, which with the addition of Texas and Oklahoma is now up to 16 teams. Yeah. But Andy, so too is the Big 12, which last week announced the conference opponent schedule for next season. And it seems like on first glance, the conference has done a good job balancing how often the projected top teams are going to play each other. And I'm excited about that. We're going to dig into that schedule and other things about the Big 12 coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much, and I never want them to stop. Like, I'm getting so amped for the Olympics coming up in just a couple weeks, Andy. Good grief. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games. Right now it's just like MLB, and then Sunday night, I was just watching the U.S. trials all night. Yeah. But the sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to fully. But FanDuel lets you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you got to do is open the app, dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, as Andy said earlier, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. How about some odds, Andy, to be the National League's #1 seed come playoff time? Phillies lead the way, -115. Would not have guessed that preseason. No. Dodgers +105. Braves +700. Then it gets steep from there, folks. Brewers fourth best odds at +2,500. And then it just tanks from there. Padres 5th at +18,000. So head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon if you want to get in on any of that action and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. On Thursday, the Big 12, the new look Big 12 as of today, announced their 2024-25 conference opponent schedules. Now, this is something that conferences are pretty typically doing every year now. And what it is we get nothing about dates. We get nothing about times. It's just that, like say we're talking Big 12. So let's say you're a Kansas Jayhawks fan. You know what schools you're going to play at home only, on the road only, and which schools you're going to play both home and road. So that's what this is. And they say in the press release that a full Big 12 schedule will be released at a later date, but an unspecified later date, I should say. As I just teased a second ago, the conference now has 16 schools. Let me just make sure we're all up to date on that since it starts today. Actually, no, I'm going to hold off on that because I'm going to talk about that some on Tuesday's show. I just remembered. So stick around for that. But per the release, quote, opponents were selected based on a combination of geography, historical results, and a poll of the coaches to best balance the schedule in terms of travel and competitiveness. And Andy, we'll get to that in a second, but I think they've done a pretty good job with it. Andy, where I want to go first, here's the kind of first question I want to ask you. For the first time, the Big 12, because of, having all these teams, now goes from 18 games to 20 games. You play 5 schools away only, 5 schools home only, and 5 schools home and away. So my question then is, now with 20 conference games, that means the Big 12 will have 11 non-con games to get to the regular season total of 31. Andy, there was a big hubbub last year about the Big 12 kind of gaming the net system and using a weak non-conference schedule to boost their rankings. And a lot of that was, they said they were doing that because the Big 12 strength of schedule was so strong. Well, I don't see them backing off that at all, because now they're adding more Big 12 games. What do you make of this and what it's going to mean for how these Big 12 schools schedule and actually the non-conference?
Yeah, there's no reason for the Big 12 to do anything differently. Like there's no like public pressure, people on ESPN saying, "Oh, look, Iowa State's non-conference schedule is bad." Like that. That's not enough for these institutions to make these sweeping changes. Somebody's going to either need to force them to make changes, or the public perception would need to be glaringly bad, or more realistically, the selection committee would have to dramatically change how they make determinations for seeding, like punishing teams with weak non-conference schedules. And I don't see that happening. So I don't see why any of these Big 12 schools why would Iowa State do anything differently?
Right.
Like Scott Van Pelt went out and trashed their schedule
yeah.
on ESPN, and Brad Brownell trashed their schedule on ESPN, but they got a 3 seed and they had a lot of success. Like there's no reason to make any alterations to that schedule. And now with less games that they have to schedule, with MTEs already being dramatically altered in the future because of various factors, including the ballooning of conference schedules, but also including, of course, NIL and the players era. And we've had multiple teams, I believe Iowa State is one of them, that has dropped out of Maui for the future and is going to commit to the players era tournament. Baylor has done that as well. Like we are seeing MTEs, which is typically where a lot of these programs get their most competitive non-conference games. We're seeing them just crash right before our eyes in a really kind of startlingly fast fashion. How quickly these tournaments that have been standout stalwarts of college basketball for decades, like they're going by the wayside, and it's happening very, very quickly. And I don't think that these teams are going to replace their 3 MTE games that they used to get in Maui or ESPN events or whatever. Like they're not going to replace them they might replace those 3 games with 1 good game. And then the other 2 are going to be your typical bye games. And we've already seen a handful of teams, some of the early birds that have released their non-conference schedule. And it was like Providence released theirs and Maryland released theirs. And those aren't exactly, they're not Big 12 schools, and they're also not like powerhouses, but they both have pretty weak non-conference schedules. So if those are programs that are doing that, like I think we're going to see a lot of teams that have non-conference schedules where you see very few games that look particularly competitive. And that's a bummer. And it's a bummer as somebody personally who covers a conference that I think kind of gets really hung out by this in the WCC. I think it's bad for conferences like the Mountain West or the A10, or even some of the other more competitive mid-major conferences, because those are the teams that are not getting scheduled. Like nobody's going to go out and seek out to go play a team like San Francisco, who beat 3 Power 5 teams last year, but is not quite good enough to really dramatically help your net. So it's like if you're a Big 12 school, if you're Arizona or Colorado or whatever, like, and you have this ballooned conference schedule now, and you're going to get Kansas and you're going to get Houston and you're going to get Baylor, like the best thing you can do is play a bunch of crappy teams, boost your strength of schedule in the boost your net ranking because you're blowing out these not very good teams, and then take your 9, 10, 11 losses in conference play and still end up in the top 35 in the net. And until the system changes, which there's not any indication that it's going to change anytime soon, those teams are going to continue to do that. You're going to continue to see a TCU team finish 500 in conference play and be 32nd in the net. And we're going to have to wonder, does this team make the tournament? And if they get their wish of expanding the tournament, then yes, they probably do. And as long as those teams continue to get rewarded for that, why would they schedule games in the non-conference that they could potentially lose when they could just schedule 9 or 10 of their 11 games against teams they're obviously going to win, put one decent game on the schedule, and then call it good? I don't see any reason for them to feel like they should change. I think they should. I think it would be better if there was more competitive games, but there's nothing motivating them to change. So I don't think it's going to.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andy. And especially in the transfer portal era where it's taking teams longer to figure out who they are and get everyone, the chemistry together, the more buy games you have to be able to do that, the better off you are. So I hear that. And that all makes a lot of sense. Just a couple other observations before we move on here. When the ACC went to 20 games a couple years ago, one of the things they started doing was having one conference game like early December, typically the first or second weekend of December. And then once you get into January, playing the other 19. We'll see if the Big 12 does anything like that to separate a game out, just to pique interest early. I don't know. We'll see. Andy, but I just, as a college basketball fan who values the regular season kind of over conference tournaments, I continued to bemoan the loss and further away from true round robin stuff. Man, I loved when conferences were able to do that. So I miss that in a big way. One thing I appreciate that we see, we haven't talked much about the actual scheduling of all this. We've just talked ramifications. I went through and really kind of looked at this a good bit. We mentioned a couple weeks ago, we think the top 5 schools in the Big 12 right now, with the little K-State knocking on the door, are Arizona, Baylor, Houston, Iowa State, and Kansas. And what I love, it talked about the way they chose how they're going to do this, is that of those 5 schools, they play exactly 2 of the other top 4, I guess I should say, schools, both home and away. They all play exactly 1 of those other 4 schools home only, and they all play exactly 1 of those 4 other schools away only. And so, Andy, I think the way you phrased it to me earlier was, it's clear that the coaches and schedulers who worked on this recognized what we're recognizing about those top 5 schools, and then did a great job of making sure, even though we don't have that true round robin that I just bemoaned, we at least are balancing how often the perceived, that's a critical word here, top 5 are playing each other.
Yeah, I think it was a nice job by the Big 12 of putting together the best matchups that they possibly could, considering the circumstance. And I think it's going to be, as it always is, an incredibly fun and competitive regular season in the Big 12 conference. But Isaac, what I want to do now is I want to talk about the Big East, not because of their scheduling, but I want to talk about the Big East because they have announced a brand new media rights deal. They're extending with Fox. They're bringing in some new partners. It's a creative way for the Big East to kind of continue to stay sustainable in an era where even a conference as prolific as the Big East is kind of feeling the strain of conference realignment and everything going on in college athletics. So we're going to talk about what they have done to keep their conference in good shape moving forward, coming up in just a second. All right, Isaac, from the SEC to the Big 12 to the Big East, to close out the show, I want to talk about the new media rights deal for the Big East Conference. Their current deal has been a 12-year deal that they signed with Fox. It is ending after the upcoming 2024-25 season. And now they're continuing a deal with Fox. They're staying with Fox. They're still going to remain their lead partner. And for good reason. It has been a fruitful partnership on both sides, being able to watch being able to watch Big East games on Friday afternoons, Friday evenings on FS1 has been something that I've enjoyed. I know a lot of other people have been able to enjoy that. They've been able to have those games there. But we're also going to have both NBC and TNT getting involved with the Big East for the first time. It's going to increase the revenue, is what ESPN's reporting. They're anticipating, the Big East member schools are anticipating a revenue increase of up to 35 to 40%. Which is a huge deal for those schools, especially the non-football, which is all of them except UConn, basically. So I think we're seeing an increase in revenue for these schools that need it. They're staying with a trusted partner in Fox. They're adding two prominent media deals with NBC and TNT. CBS is out. They're gone, so they're going to lose CBS, but they're going to be on Peacock now. TNT obviously is kind of panicking as they lose the NBA, so they're trying to fill a lot of airtime during basketball season. And what's a better way to do that than to get involved with a conference that a lot of people really like to watch? So it's a great deal for the Big East, not just for men's basketball, although that is obviously a huge part of it, but they're also going to work with women's basketball as well, where there's been a ton of success, especially with UConn's program. So this is a really big deal for the Big East, a conference that, hadn't been challenged. Like the Pac-12 was the first domino to fall, and right now a lot of the attention's on the ACC. The Big East hasn't been in those conversations because those programs are not as desirable for the SEC. The SEC and the Big 12 and the Big 10 are just gobbling up everybody that they can, but they're focusing on football schools right now. So the Big East has a little bit more time to kind of get their ducks in a row before, things start coming after them. And I think being able to come up with a deal here, it's also a shorter deal, which I think is beneficial for them. The ACC is kind of locked into this long deal, and I think it's really impacting them negatively. So the Big East was smart and intentional of going after a shorter term deal, but that brings more money immediately to their member schools. And it feels like, reading through the lines on this, that this is a move that is good for the fans. It's good for the Big East member schools. It's good for the conference. It's good for college basketball. And I'm glad to see the Big East get this done.
And Andy, I'm right with you. I think it's a brilliant deal to basically cut in half the length of the last commitment because of how quickly our landscape continues to change. You just don't want to be locked into something that is going to hamstring or completely, as we sit here on July 1st and there's no Pac-12 now, right? Like we see that and exactly what you said about the ACC. So a brilliant move. I like getting TNT in here, man, because it is a brand that is known and trusted and loved by NBA folks. And I know it won't be all the same personnel, but there is a brand awareness that I think legitimately will help us in college basketball because of that. So I'm looking forward to that. Once again, you and I have talked about this a couple times now. So NBC, even though this deal doesn't start, this upcoming season is the last season of the old deal. This deal doesn't start till 25-26, but NBC is going ahead and getting in on it some with Peacock streaming games this year. I think it was up to 25. I'm looking back, but you and I have talked about multiple times, right? Like the Players Era Invitational or Players Era Festival is going to be on a streaming partner. That's the expectation. There was something else recently we talked about that is a streaming situation. And so folks, we got to continue to get used to these not always being on OTAs, over the air programming that we're used to. But with Peacock and with Max being part of this, it's going to be a thing. And this is a first for the Big East to have a streaming deal as part of it. But thankfully one, I think, between Peacock and Max that most people have access to, and that's a good thing. And so, Andy, I love that there is a guarantee that every game is going to be televised. Musketeer Report, which is part of a Xavier website, had just gone behind the scenes with a source familiar with all this and said, quote, assurance was given that every Big East game will continue to be televised, whether through broadcast or streaming platforms. And then one other final point, and then I'll toss it back to you, Andy, is you mentioned those Friday things, man. And you and I have talked a lot about that and how we want to see that not only sustain, but grow. We see some good marquee games while football's still going on, while college football's still going on, but we'd like to see more of it throughout the season. Big East has done a good job of that. And so kudos to them for continuing that.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head on a lot of great points there. I'll pick up on the TNT point. One thing that will be really interesting to me is there's obviously a lot of overlap, people who watch both college and the NBA, but there's also a lot of people who are very staunchly pro college, anti NBA, or vice versa, pro NBA, anti college. And I'm very curious if TNT will invite some of those NBA fans who are used to watching that product and don't watch very much college basketball, if the Big East is a big enough draw to potentially bring some more of those fans. And that's kind of what's going to be tested here, is whether that, obviously, people will flock to TNT to watch Big East games who would have watched them regardless. But I'm curious if they'll kind of catch any of those fans. I saw a recent, I mean, this happens after the draft, where people start watching clips of guys that got drafted by their team and discover players that you and I and most of the people listening to this podcast in July have heard about and watched extensively for many years. And the one that really stood out to me was a thread of Boston fans just absolutely going crazy, geeking out about Baylor Shireman. And it's like, yes, this dude has been really good for a really long time. And you know, it's I think one way to react to that is frustration of like, well, why didn't you watch him before? You could have watched how great he was at Creighton for 2 years. Like, we're not going to make fun of people for not watching South Dakota State basketball. I think that's reasonable, but it's also at the same time, it's like, we're glad you're here now. Like, we're glad you're seeing this now, and you're getting geeked about this guy. You're excited about, you know, like, wow, he's a really good basketball player. He's a great hooper. Like, yeah, he's really fun to watch, and he's been fun to watch for 2 years. And I would hope that, like, in that instance of, like, you know, we'll just stick with that specific example. If you're a Boston fan and your Celtics are off one night on a Friday and you're scrolling through and you see TNT and you see Creighton's playing, you might flip it on because you're like, oh yeah, that's where Baylor came from. Like, those are the kind of things that are subtle ways that this might grow the sport a little bit. And I think TNT being involved specifically helps with that, because again, Peacock and Max, it's great. And I think it's going to be, it's the right move to get in on the streaming side of things, but people are not going to casually just happen upon that. Most likely that's going to be more people seeking out the game and going to Max, going to Peacock, whatever, to find those games. But TNT, I think, can help capture some more casual fans or former NBA fans. And that feels like a potentially good way to grow the sport as well.
All right, Andy, fun stuff. It is wild that now it is July 1, and that means we've got all the new realignment stuff happening. Going to have to get our brains wrapped around it and stop talking about the old teams as what they once were. So we'll get to all of that. Folks, if you haven't subscribed to the show on video and audio, as Andy said earlier, very easy to do. If you're watching here on YouTube, just hit subscribe. Make sure you hit that bell notification as well. If you're not part of the Locked On College Basketball Discord, man, we'd absolutely love to have you. The link is in the show notes, and it's free to join. Literally costs you nothing other than just subscribing to it and being part of it and hanging out with other people that love college basketball. Well, gang, we end as we always do. Apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. Welcome to the Big 12 Arizona Wildcats. That's the first one I thought of. And until tomorrow, peace.